The dreaming spires, the red brick titans. They are, for many, the institutions which come to define their lives. The object and aim of years of study for which exams are the key to the door. But that key has been lost, and universities are left wondering how to decide who to let in without them. Newsnight has spent the day talking to a number of university vice-chancellors and university admissions officers. The picture they paint is of a sector which is confused, somewhat chaotic, uncertain of what to do next in a political situation which is still evolving, and where the systems which are supposed to deal with the excesses of the standardisation still haven't been developed. In the words of one, we're flying blind. There are lots of considerations that university admissions tutors are weighing up in making their decisions. For a start, they're trying to determine what their capacity to take more students actually is. For example, they can't be sure how many foreign students will come. Many, I was told, can't be confident they can even get flights. Then, they can't be sure how many of their own existing students they'll have around, who will be able to take up their years abroad or work placements, all up in the air thanks to COVID. They can't be sure how many students with offers who haven't met their grades might appeal and then be successful and then be automatically given a place. They can't be sure how many will be successful in their appeals and then spurn their institution and go to a different one for which they now have the grades. And then they can't be sure how many extra students they'll be able to take as a result of government social distancing guidelines, something they are legally obliged to consider. And then there's the cap, a limit on the number of students UK universities were allowed to take this year. This was a cap introduced when it was assumed that there would be very few international students applying this academic year, and a worry that certain institutions would recruit aggressively for domestic ones in a bid to stave off funding disaster. But the surprising thing is how well both international and domestic demand has held up. Many in the sector now think that the cap is doing more harm than good.
If we get close to the student numbers cap, there are some students who we would have wanted to admit who we will not be able to admit, and that's will be the case right across the country. It looked as though it was going to be necessary to keep stability in the sector and to prevent predatory behaviour from some universities. It turns out probably to have been unnecessary. I really hope that DfE does not decide that it wants to retain this as a permanent feature of the system. It's not in the interests of young people for somebody in Whitehall to decide how many students should go to university.
Is it good first?
There is confusion in the sector about what is to come. Rumours swirl of a potential retreat by Gavin Williamson and some return to simply using teacher assessment. If that happens with the cap in place, with existing uncertainties, some vice-chancellors fear chaos.
If you do try and go back to predicted grades, you can't take places away from people. You will then start to hit up against a student number control. You can take that away, but then you still face two other constraints, which are social distancing and accommodation for students in the places they want to go. So you may find suddenly predicted grades get you a place that you can't take up for other reasons. So I think that would be a very unfortunate track to go down.
And universities are trying to calculate all of this, all of their numbers, against a ticking clock, with term around the corner and an appeals process which still hasn't been confirmed. It is not hard to see an endpoint where many students appeal successfully, only for it to be too late. Ibrahim could well be in that position. Predicted an A star in maths, a requirement for a place to read economics at UCL, he was downgraded. They've said if his appeal is successful, he can go, but time is short.
They gave me a timed deadline. They said that if it's not successfully appealed by the 18th of September, then I won't be let in. I'm heartbroken, really.
One Vice-Chancellor told Newsnight that they worry that the cohort of 2020 in the top universities could be, in their words, the poshest for years if appeals aren't worked out in time for the poorest to get in. The former already have their keys to the door. The latter are left wondering what they have to do to deserve the same.
Lewis Goodall, I'm joined now by Edinburgh University Vice-Chancellor Professor Peter Mathieson, former Universities Minister and Conservative peer Lord Willits, and the Liberal Democrats Education Spokesperson Layla Moran. Thank you all for joining us tonight. First of all, David Willits, we've just heard that the government will pay for appeals from schools. That very much helps schools, but it doesn't make it any fairer for individual pupils. Isn't the best way to make it fair to follow the Scottish system and simply let the pupils A-level results stand on the predictive results and nothing more?
Well, look, there clearly are individual examples of injustice, and that's why it's great news that there's going to be no charge for going through the appeals process.
Well, there wouldn't have been to pupils themselves, to be fair.
The schools would have paid. But let's face it, the underlying problem, given that the virus means we don't have actual A-level results, is that the predicted grades from the teachers across the country would have been a 12–13% increase in A-level grades from the previous year. And that was unevenly distributed. In some schools, the culture about how you predict grades is different from the others. So you needed to have some moderation, which has ended up still with a 2.5% increase in good grades. So you needed to have that process. However, there clearly have been cases when the algorithm has not taken proper account of changes in a school's performance, and that's absolutely a reason why individuals and schools should be appealing.
But Lord Willetts, the time is of the essence, and time is so short. You heard from Ibrahim there, who was going to be the first, or may well hopefully still be the first in his family to go to university. He'd worked incredibly hard during the year. He's heartbroken. He was predicted an A star. He got an A, which means he doesn't get into UCL unless the appeals move very quickly. Isn't that just profoundly unfair? It also runs entirely against the government's and the Conservatives' supposed mantra that ability is all. You should not be held back by social disadvantage. That's completely running contrary to someone like Ibrahim's position.
Absolutely. And of course, overall, we've actually seen an increase in the number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds getting places, reaching a new record. But that doesn't help on the individual cases such as the one you described. And let's be clear, UCL have been actively encouraged, I don't know their exact policy, to take account of personal circumstances.
So should they get Ibrahim in? That's actually a very simple question then. Do you think UCL should open the door for Ibrahim right now rather than an appeal?
UCL certainly have the power to do that.
Right.
If
let me turn to Professor Mathieson now. First of all, Professor Mathieson, at Edinburgh, you've probably got just about as many English students as you have Scottish students. Wouldn't it be a much fairer position to follow the Scottish, to have England follow the Scottish example and go in on predictive grades, both for the English students coming as well as the Scottish students who are now in that position?
Well, we handle applications from Scotland and from the rest of the UK differently because they're in different categories of admissions. So Scottish student numbers are capped by the Scottish Government because Scottish Government underwrites their tuition fees. And so they're not in competition with students from England.
No, but wouldn't it make it much more straightforward? Wouldn't it be much fairer on English students, without even reference to Scottish students, if the government simply followed the Scottish change?
Well, we take the grades that are reported to us by UCAS, and the UCAS deadline has been extended this year to allow for some of this uncertainty and to allow for some appeals. What we've said in Edinburgh is that if an appeal is successful and a student gets the grades that we originally offered them for their conditional offer, we will honour that offer. And in the vast majority of cases, that would mean that they would get a place this year. If, for whatever reason, there was a constraint on space for studios or placements or whatever, we would offer them either an alternative course or a guaranteed place for next year. So we're trying to be as fair and reasonable as we can.
But you wouldn't follow the example of Worcester College, for example, at Oxford, and say that, you know, individual universities can make up their own minds. You wouldn't decide simply to follow what Worcester's done.
We are honouring all offers if the grades are successful. We won't go below our minimum requirements because we don't set these minimum requirements for any other reason than we think that they represent a level of ability which will lead to success on the course. It's not just about getting students into university. We want to be sure that they can succeed once they get here.
So you were speaking to the university's minister today. What were you saying to her and what was she saying to you?
She was looking for me to give the guarantee that I've just mentioned to you, that we would honour offers if students on appeal managed to achieve the grades that they were originally aiming to achieve to satisfy our offer, and I gave her that guarantee.
And has she been phoning all the universities, do you think?
I didn't ask her, but I know she's probably phoned several. But the other thing that we discussed is that example of, I mean, I don't know the details of Ibrahim that you highlighted, but she highlighted the example of the outstanding school, the outstanding student in a school where maybe the track record of that school in getting students into top universities is not so constant. And she was making the point that those are exactly the kinds of students that they would encourage to appeal, and they would hope that if the appeal is successful, they will get in. And
Yeah, but they've been disadvantaged in the first place by simply being at a school which has not performed well, perhaps even 5 years ago. And I want to bring Layla Moran in on that point. Layla Moran, Keir Starmer changed his position this morning from saying they should look at all options to say, yes, England should follow the Scottish decision. Do the Liberal Democrats agree with that?
So my position right now is, I remember when I was a teacher, I would always want to predict what my students would get on their best day. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for those students who are affected by this. This is clearly very unfair, and that's all anyone wants, is a fair system. I've stopped short of calling for centre-assessed grades to be used immediately, because actually what I want to see is the underlying algorithm. I want to understand, why is it that the government, when they saw that it was disproportionately students from poorer backgrounds who were affected, parts of the country that tend to have those poorer students in it that are downgraded, why they didn't then change this? And we saw from Scotland there was a whole raft of time where the government could have done this better. They could have moderated this better. For the host of reasons that were in the video before you came to us for these comments, I think that this now needs to be sorted out. But what this is a government who has lost control of this process.
On the basis that you want to look it over and you want to assess it, now you're in a position where, as a political party, you need to take a position, not least because this is a very fast-moving story. So what exactly would the Liberal Democrats bring to the table? What extra information would you, if you were there as a leading, the education minister, what would you be saying should happen right now? Not what you might be examining, what will you be doing?
What should have happened was that when...
No, what should you do now? No, what should you do now?
What I would be doing now is looking forward to what's going to happen in these GCSEs that are coming up next week. I would be setting up very clear guidance for universities for how they should be extra lenient, particularly for those areas that are badly affected, so that there is no child whose future life chances are going to be affected by this fiasco. And finally, and I'm glad that the government has capitulated and said that appeals are going to be free, but I would also encourage them to do as Scotland has done, which is to allow the families and the students themselves to appeal directly to the exam boards. That is not the case right now. It has to be done through the school. Every time you put a barrier between the students and their just outcome, that decreases the chances that those students are going to take those up. So those are the
very quickly on that point, David Willetts, rather than the school be up to the school to appeal, if individual students think they have a better chance to go forward appealing themselves, should they be allowed to do that?
The basis of the appeal will often be how the school as a whole has been treated. And I'm sure schools will be absolutely up there helping their students with appeals that they make. We do now need to get on with those appeals to tackle injustices. And the Ofqual requirements make it clear that if your school has improved its performance in the last few years and it's not being captured in their methodology, you have good grounds for appeal.
And on a specific point of resits, we've seen papers which show the resits can cost north of £200 a time. Now, that often is not paid by the school because the pupil is deemed to have left. Isn't that absolutely ridiculous and really disadvantages poor students that they're going to have to pay for resits? That's what the government should be doing, surely, saying, OK, we're going to pay for the resits.
There may be a case for that, but look, actually, I think the priority is different. I think the priority is to get through these appeals as quickly as possible and as get as many possible of these students into the universities they wish to go to.
So, Peter, let me just ask Peter Mathieson, we're running out of time. Just very briefly, you studied medicine at Barts. Do you think you'd have got into Edinburgh, for example, on what's been happening this year from the position you were in?
I hate to correct one of my alumni, Kirsty, but it wasn't Barts, it was the London Hospital. Now merged with Barts, but not in my time. I wouldn't have got in now, no. My grades weren't good enough to compete these days. And that's a really interesting point. I mean, I went to a school where nowadays I would be offered a contextual offer based on the school I was in. And Edinburgh is very explicit about contextual offers, trying to not just look at the bald grades, but to look at the context in which they're achieved and to allow students from disadvantaged backgrounds to qualify for courses, including medicine, with a lower level of grades based on that context.
Isn't it the case that we actually should be making judgments on who goes to university on a completely different set of criteria, Professor Mathieson?
We are unduly dependent on exam grades, and that's why I'm interested in things like interviews, in school statements, in other various aptitude tests. There's much more to succeeding, particularly in some of the professions like the one that I studied in medicine, much more than just being able to pass exams. And we have to find ways assessing that more reliably.
Well, let's just put that very much to Lord Willetts, because, of course, the Conservative government was a government that has completely narrowed the amount of the type of A-levels and the amount of them needed, and not had a broad, like, you know, for example, the back, or even what's happening in Scotland, which would be 5 or 6 hires.
Yeah, and I rather agree with Peter. I think that the focus on narrowing down to 3 A-levels is one of the worst features of the English education system.
And have you said that to Michael Gove?
It's long been my view, and I have said it to Michael Gove. I think we specialise too early. We should have a broader education for longer. That is the biggest single weakness in English secondary education.
Thank you all very much for coming to us tonight.